The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and Oliver Hartley's knees were soaked through his thin trousers as he knelt on the cold stone outside the Grey Anchor Tavern, his small hands moving fast over a stranger's boots, with a rag that had gone thin from years of use. Looking up meant losing time, and time meant pennies, and pennies meant bread for his mother who lay at home with a fever that had not broken in 6 days. "Faster, boy," the man snapped, and Oliver's fingers moved quicker, though his knuckles had cracked and bled 2 days before, and had not healed. He swallowed the pain the way he swallowed everything else, and when the man dropped a single copper coin into his palm and walked off without another word, Oliver closed his fist around it like it was the last coin in the world. For him, it very well might have been. He had 11 pennies. 11, and it was not enough. The landlord, a thin, sharp man named Mr. Grover, had told him that morning that if the rent was not paid by the end of the week, he and his mother would be put out onto the street, fever or no fever. Oliver had stood in the doorway and promised the money would come, though he had no idea how, and Mr. Grover had only laughed and shut the door in his face. The street was busy with carts and merchants, and men in long coats hurrying to escape the rain, and Oliver moved from one pair of boots to the next, calling out in a voice that cracked with cold, "Polish your boots, sir. Only a penny. Only a penny." Again and again, until the words blurred together and lost their meaning. Most people walked past without a glance. Some sneered. One woman, kinder than the rest, gave him 2 pennies and told him to go home before he caught his death. But Oliver could not go home, was where his mother lay burning with fever, and pennies were the only thing standing between her and the workhouse, or worse. By midday, his stomach had begun to ache with hunger, and his hands had gone numb from the cold. But he kept working, kneeling in puddles, wiping mud from boots that belonged to men who would never remember his face. He thought of his mother's voice, weak and thin now, telling him stories at night before the fever took hold of her properly. Stories about a life she never fully explained, about a time before he was born, when things had been different, when she had known a kindness she never spoke of by name. He had asked her once who his father was, and she had gone quiet in a way that frightened him more than any answer could have. "Someone who could not stay," she had said, and then she had turned away, and Oliver had learned not to ask again. It did not matter, he told himself. A father was a story for other boys. He had work to do, and a mother to save, and that was enough of a world for him. It was near 4 o'clock, with the light already beginning to fade behind the gray clouds, when the sound of hooves and the creak of fine wheels drew his attention up from the boots he was polishing. A carriage, black and gleaming despite the rain, rolled to a stop outside the tavern, pulled by 2 horses so well groomed they looked as though they belonged in a painting rather than on a muddy street. Oliver had seen carriages before, but never one so fine, and never one that stopped so close to where he knelt. The door of the carriage opened, and a man stepped down, tall, composed, dressed in a dark coat that had clearly never touched a puddle in its life. Behind him came another man, older, with a long, thin face, and the stiff posture of someone who spent his life following just behind another man's shoulder. Oliver did not know their names, but he knew, the way children who have grown up hungry always know, that these were men of great importance, men who could change a life with a single word if they chose to. His heart began to beat faster, though he could not have said why. Perhaps it was hunger making him foolish, but something in him refused to let the carriage pass without trying. He scrambled to his feet, rag still in hand, and hurried toward the 2 men before his mind could talk him out of it. "Sir," he called, his voice thinner than he wanted it to be. "Let me shine your boots, sir. For free. I only ask a moment of your time." The older man, the one with the long face, turned sharply and raised a hand, as though to wave Oliver away like an insect. "Get back, boy. The Duke has no time for the likes of you." But the tall man in the dark coat had already stopped walking. He looked down at Oliver with an expression that was difficult to read, something between curiosity and impatience, and after a moment of silence that felt to Oliver like an hour, he spoke. "Let him be, Pemberton," the Duke said, his voice low and even. "A moment costs me nothing." Oliver dropped to his knees at once, working the rag over the Duke's boots, with more care and speed than he had shown all day, though his hands trembled, not from cold this time, but from something closer to fear. He did not know why his heart hammered so hard in his chest. He had polished 100 boots that week alone. But there was something about the way the Duke looked at him, something searching, that made Oliver feel as though he were being read like a page in a book. "You work quickly," the Duke said after a moment, watching him. "I have to, sir," Oliver answered without looking up. "My mother is ill, she cannot work, and I must earn enough for the rent and for a doctor, if I can manage it." Pemberton made a small, impatient sound, the kind adults make when they think a child is exaggerating for sympathy. But the Duke did not move away. Instead, he crouched down, which surprised Oliver so greatly that his hands stopped moving entirely. So Dukes did not crouch. Dukes did not come close enough to see the mud on a boy's face, or the hollows beneath his eyes. "What is your mother's name?" the Duke asked. "Eleanor, sir. Eleanor Hartley." Something shifted in the Duke's face at the sound of the name, though Oliver was too young and too tired to notice it fully. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by the same composed expression the Duke had worn since stepping down from his carriage. "And your name?" "Oliver, sir. Oliver Hartley." The Duke studied him for a long moment, his eyes moving over Oliver's face, the way one might study a portrait, searching for something familiar in the lines of a stranger's features. Oliver shifted uncomfortably under the attention, unsure whether he had done something wrong. "How old are you, Oliver?" "9, sir. I'll be 10 in the spring." The Duke's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, and he rose to his feet slowly, brushing invisible dust from his coat, though there was none. Pemberton watched his employer with a look of confusion, clearly unable to understand why a Duke would spend even a minute more than necessary speaking with a street boy. "Your Grace," Pemberton said carefully, "we are already behind schedule. The meeting with Lord Ashford." "In a moment," the Duke said, his voice sharper now, and Pemberton fell silent immediately. Oliver stood, unsure whether he had finished his task, or whether he was meant to keep speaking. The coin he had hoped for, even the smallest coin, seemed suddenly unimportant next to the strange tension that had settled over the two men. "Sir," Oliver said quietly, gathering his courage, the way he had learned to gather it every single day since his mother had fallen ill. "Please, if you have any influence at all, could you help me find a physician for my mother? I have some money saved, not much, but I would work for the rest. I would work for years if I had to. Only please, she is very sick, and I do not know what to do." It was the most Oliver had said to any stranger in months, and the words tumbled out of him faster than he intended, driven by a desperation that had been building for days and had finally found somewhere to go. He expected to be dismissed, the way most people dismissed him, with a wave of the hand or a muttered word about beggars and street children. Instead, the Duke looked at him for a long, long moment, and something in his eyes had changed entirely from the cold composure he had worn moments before. It was not pity Oliver saw there. It was something closer to recognition, though Oliver could not have named it if asked. "Where do you live?" the Duke asked. "Turner's Row, sir, the building at the end, by the old mill." The Duke turned to Pemberton. "Send Dr. Whitfield to that address within the hour. Tell him it comes on my authority, and tell him to spare no expense in the treatment." Pemberton's mouth opened, clearly ready to protest the strangeness of the order, but something in the Duke's expression silenced him before he could speak a single word. He nodded stiffly instead, and turned to walk toward the carriage to relay the instructions. Oliver stood frozen, certain he had misheard, certain this was some trick of exhaustion and hunger playing on his mind. "Sir," he began, "I cannot pay for a physician of that quality. I only have—" "You will not need to pay," the Duke said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. "Not today." Oliver's eyes filled with tears he had been holding back for days, weeks even. Tears he had refused to let fall because there had been no time for them, no room in his exhausted body for anything but the next task, the next coin, the next hour of survival. Now, faced with unexpected kindness from a stranger who owed him nothing, the tears came freely, and he did not bother to wipe them away. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, heavier than anything Oliver had ever held, and placed it into the boy's hands. "For tonight, and for whatever else you and your mother need, until the doctor arrives." Oliver could not speak. He simply nodded, clutching the pouch to his chest as though it might vanish if he loosened his grip even slightly. As the Duke turned to walk back toward his carriage, he paused, glancing back at Oliver one final time, his eyes lingering on the boy's face, with an expression that was equal parts wonder and unease, though Oliver was too overwhelmed with gratitude to notice the depth of it. "Oliver," the Duke said quietly, "I may call on you and your mother again, if that would be permitted." "Of course, sir," Oliver said quickly. "Any time, sir. Anything you wish." The Duke nodded once, climbed into his carriage, and was gone within moments, the sound of hooves fading into the noise of the busy street. Oliver stood alone in the rain, the leather pouch clutched tightly in his hands, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and confusion he did not fully understand. He did not know, as he ran through the wet streets toward Turner's Row, his feet splashing through puddles without any care for the cold, that the Duke, sitting in the carriage behind him, was staring out the window with a look of quiet turmoil on his face, his mind circling back 9 years, to a woman he had once loved and been forced to leave behind for reasons of duty and family expectation. He did not know that the name Eleanor Hartley had struck the Duke like a blow he had spent nearly a decade trying to forget. He only knew that hope, a feeling he had almost forgotten the shape of, was blooming in his chest for the first time in longer than he could remember, and he ran toward his mother's bedside faster than he had ever run in his life, the pouch of coins bouncing against his ribs with every step, carrying with it a promise he could not yet understand the size of. When he burst through the door of their small room, his mother stirred weakly on the thin mattress, her eyes fluttering open at the sound of his footsteps. "Oliver," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're soaked through. Come away from the door." "Mother," he said, kneeling beside her, his voice trembling with excitement he could barely contain, "a doctor is coming. A real doctor, sent by a Duke himself. Everything is going to be all right now. I promise you, everything is going to be all right." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, something flickered across her fevered face that looked almost like fear rather than relief, though Oliver, in his exhaustion and joy, did not notice it at all. He only saw his mother's hand reach for his, weak but present, and he held it tightly, certain that the worst of their troubles were finally coming to an end. He had no way of knowing that they were only just beginning. Outside, the rain continued to fall over the city, washing the mud from the streets, but doing nothing to wash away the truth that had been buried for 9 long years. A truth that was already beginning to stir awake inside a carriage, rolling slowly back toward a grand estate on the far side of town, where a man who had once loved deeply, and lost even more deeply, now sat in silence, staring at his own hands, wondering if fate had just placed his own son directly in his path. The physician arrived within the hour, exactly as the Duke had promised, and Oliver watched from the corner of the small room as a tall, gray-haired man named Dr. Whitfield knelt beside his mother's bed, his hands moving with a gentleness Oliver had never seen from anyone who was paid to help. The doctor's bag was full of instruments Oliver did not recognize, bottles of medicine with labels he could not read, and a quiet confidence that filled the cramped room, like warmth from a fire. "Her fever is high," Dr. Whitfield said after a long examination, "but not beyond help. She has been fighting an infection in her lungs, likely made worse by the cold and the damp of this room. With proper medicine and rest, she should recover, though it will take time and care." Oliver felt his knees weaken with relief, and he had to steady himself against the wall to keep from sinking to the floor entirely. "She will live?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She will live," the doctor confirmed, "if she is kept warm, fed properly, and given the medicine I am about to prepare." It was the best news Oliver had received in his entire life, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe fully, without the tight knot of fear that had lived in his chest since his mother first fell ill. He thanked the doctor more times than was necessary, and the doctor, patient and kind, simply nodded and continued his work, mixing powders into a small glass of water for Eleanor to drink. Over the following days, the change in his mother was remarkable. The fever broke on the 3rd day after the doctor's medicine, and though she remained weak, her eyes grew clearer, her voice grew stronger, and she began to eat small portions of the food Oliver brought home each evening, purchased with the coins from the pouch the Duke had given him. Oliver had never seen so much money in his life, and he spent it carefully, buying bread, broth, and coal for the small stove that had sat cold and unused for weeks. He did not see the Duke again during those first days, though he thought of him often, wondering what had compelled a man of such importance to stop for a boy polishing boots in the rain. It did not make sense to him, not fully, but he was too grateful to question it deeply. Some things, he decided, simply happened, and it was not a child's place to ask why kindness arrived when it did. On the 6th day, however, a knock came at the door of their small room, and when Oliver opened it, he found not the Duke himself, but a young woman in a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back neatly, carrying a basket filled with fresh bread, fruit, and a folded letter bearing a wax seal Oliver did not recognize. "My name is Charlotte," the woman said with a warm smile. "I work in the household of the Duke of Ashford. He asked that I bring this to you, and to check on your mother's health." Oliver stepped aside to let her in, still unsure how to behave in the presence of someone connected to a household so far above his own station. Charlotte moved through the small room without any hint of disgust or discomfort, kneeling beside Eleanor's bed to greet her kindly, asking after her health with genuine concern rather than mere politeness. "You are very lucky," Charlotte said to Oliver as she unpacked the basket onto the small table. "The Duke does not often take such an interest in matters outside his estate. Whatever you said to him, it must have moved him greatly." Oliver did not know what to say to that. He had only told the truth, the same truth he would have told anyone who might listen, but there had been something in the way the Duke looked at him that suggested his words alone were not the whole reason for the kindness he had received. He decided not to mention this thought to Charlotte, unsure of how to explain a feeling he barely understood himself. Eleanor, meanwhile, had grown very quiet since Charlotte's arrival, her eyes fixed on the folded letter resting on the table. When Charlotte finally left, promising to return in a few days with more supplies, Eleanor asked Oliver to bring her the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she took it from him. "What does it say, Mother?" Oliver asked, watching her break the wax seal with unsteady fingers. Eleanor read the letter in silence, her face growing pale despite the color that had finally begun to return to her cheeks over the past days. When she finished, she folded it carefully and set it aside, saying nothing for a long moment. "Mother?" Oliver pressed gently. "Is something wrong?" "No," she said finally. Though her voice carried a weight, Oliver did not understand. "The Duke wishes to visit us himself, once I am strong enough to receive him." Oliver's heart leapt with excitement at the thought, though he noticed his mother did not share his enthusiasm. Instead, she looked toward the small window of their room, her expression distant and troubled, as though she were staring not at the gray sky outside, but at something far in her past that she had hoped never to face again. "Will that be all right?" Oliver asked, suddenly uncertain. Eleanor took his hand in hers, holding it tightly. "It will be all right, my love. I only need time to prepare myself." Oliver did not press further, though the strange sadness in his mother's voice stayed with him for the rest of the evening. He busied himself with small tasks around the room, tidying what little they owned, grateful simply for the fact that his mother was alive and improving, even if something about the Duke's coming visit seemed to weigh on her more heavily than he could explain. Over the following week, Eleanor grew stronger each day, until she was able to sit up fully, and even walk a few steps around the room without assistance. Oliver continued his work polishing boots in the streets, though with less desperation now that the pouch of coins had eased their immediate troubles, and each evening he returned home, to find his mother a little more like the woman he remembered from before her illness, a woman who used to hum softly while mending clothes, and tell him stories of faraway places she had never actually visited. It was on the 10th day since their encounter with the Duke that Charlotte returned once more, this time to inform them that the Duke himself would be arriving within the hour, having finally received word that Eleanor's health had improved enough to receive visitors. Oliver felt a rush of excitement mixed with nervousness, hurrying to make their small room as presentable as possible, though there was little he could do to disguise its poverty. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat very still on the edge of her bed, dressed in the cleanest of her few garments, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Oliver noticed she had grown quiet again, her earlier improvement in spirit replaced by a tension he could not fully name. He wanted to ask her what troubled her so deeply about a visit that should have been a moment of gratitude and joy, but before he could gather the courage to speak, the sound of a carriage rolling to a stop outside their building reached his ears, and his heart began to race with anticipation. Moments later, a knock came at the door, and Oliver rushed to open it, finding the Duke standing there once more, dressed as finely as before, though his expression carried none of the cold composure Oliver remembered from their first meeting. Instead, there was something almost hesitant in the way the Duke stood at the threshold, as though he were unsure of his welcome. "Your Grace," Oliver said, stepping aside quickly to let him enter. "Thank you again, for everything. My mother is much better now." The Duke nodded, stepping into the small room, his eyes immediately finding Eleanor where she sat on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them felt heavier than any words could have been. Oliver stood awkwardly near the door, sensing that something significant was passing between the two adults, though he could not understand what it might be. "Eleanor," the Duke said finally, his voice low and careful. "Edmund," Eleanor replied, and Oliver's eyes widened slightly at the familiarity in her tone. A familiarity that suggested these two adults knew each other far better than a simple duke and a grateful stranger ever would. Oliver looked between them, confusion beginning to stir in his chest, though he said nothing, sensing instinctively that this was not a moment for a child's questions. The Duke's eyes moved briefly toward Oliver, then back to Eleanor, and something passed across his face that Oliver could not name, though it looked almost like sorrow mixed with disbelief. "May I speak with you alone?" the Duke asked Eleanor gently. Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Oliver, with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something between fear and resignation. "Oliver," she said softly, "why don't you go see if Charlotte needs help carrying anything else from the carriage?" Oliver did not want to leave, sensing that something important was about to happen, something that concerned him deeply, even if he did not yet understand why. But he had never disobeyed his mother, and he was not about to begin now, especially not in front of a duke. He nodded slowly and stepped out into the hallway, closing the door gently behind him, though he lingered close enough to hear the faint murmur of voices from within, unable to make out the words but sensing the weight of whatever truth was being spoken between the two adults who had once, it seemed, known each other far more intimately than Oliver had ever imagined. He stood in that narrow, dim hallway for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and unease, wondering what secret his mother had carried all these years, a secret that seemed, somehow, to be unraveling itself in that small room just beyond the door, a secret that Oliver was beginning to suspect might have everything to do with him. The voices inside the room had grown softer, and Oliver pressed closer to the door, his ear nearly touching the old wood, though the words remained frustratingly unclear. He caught fragments only, his mother's voice trembling in a way he had never heard before, and the Duke's voice, low and steady, though it carried an undertone of something Oliver could only describe as grief. He thought of knocking, of simply stepping back inside and asking what was happening, but something held him back, some instinct that told him this conversation was not meant for his ears, not yet. Instead, he sat down on the floor of the hallway, his back against the wall, and waited, his mind spinning with questions he could not answer. Why had his mother called the Duke by his first name, as though they were old friends, or something more? Why had the Duke looked at him so strangely both times they had met, as though searching for something hidden in Oliver's face? And why, above everything else, had his mother grown so afraid at the mention of this visit, when the Duke had done nothing but show them kindness? The door opened sooner than Oliver expected, and Charlotte, who had returned from the carriage with a small crate of supplies, gently touched his shoulder and guided him back inside, saying that his mother wished to speak with him. Oliver rose quickly, his heart pounding, and stepped back into the room to find his mother sitting very still, her eyes red, though she was not crying now. The Duke stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on some distant point outside. "Oliver," Eleanor said softly, gesturing for him to sit beside her. "Come here, my love." He crossed the room and sat down, taking her hand automatically, though his eyes kept drifting toward the Duke, waiting for some explanation of the strange tension that had filled the room only moments before. "There is something I must tell you," Eleanor began, her voice steadier now than it had been, though still fragile at the edges. "Something I should have told you long ago, but I was afraid, and fear made a coward of me for many years." Oliver's chest tightened. "What is it, Mother?" Eleanor glanced briefly at the Duke, who gave the smallest of nods, as though encouraging her to continue, though his expression remained heavy with something Oliver could not name. "You have asked me before about your father," Eleanor said, and I told you he was someone who could not stay. That was true, in its way, though it was not the whole truth. The whole truth is more complicated, and I am only now finding the courage to share it with you." Oliver's heart began to race, and he glanced toward the Duke, a strange and impossible thought beginning to form in his mind, though he pushed it away, as too fantastic to consider seriously. 9 years ago, Eleanor continued, before you were born, I knew a man very well. We cared for each other deeply, more deeply than I have cared for anyone before or since. But circumstances, and the expectations placed upon him by his family, meant that we could not stay together. He was promised to another, for reasons of duty rather than affection, and I was left to face the consequences of our time together alone. Oliver's eyes moved slowly from his mother to the Duke, and back again, the impossible thought refusing to be pushed away any longer. "Mother," he whispered, "are you saying—" "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. "The Duke, Edmund, is your father, Oliver. He has been your father since the day you were born, though circumstances kept him from ever knowing it." The room fell into a silence so complete that Oliver could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He looked at the Duke, really looked at him, searching his face the way the Duke had searched Oliver's own face during their first meeting outside the tavern, and for the first time, he began to notice the similarities that had gone unnoticed before. The shape of the jaw, the particular way his eyebrows arched when deep in thought. "I did not know," the Duke said quietly, breaking the silence at last, his voice thick with an emotion Oliver had never expected to hear from a man of such power and composure. "I swear to you, Oliver, I did not know you existed until the moment your mother spoke your name to me, only days ago. Had I known, I would never have allowed a single day to pass without you both by my side." Oliver did not know what to feel. Relief, perhaps, that the strange emptiness he had always carried regarding his father finally had an answer. Confusion, certainly, at how quickly his entire understanding of his own life had shifted in the span of a single conversation, and something else too. Something closer to anger, though he could not fully justify it, a quiet resentment for 9 years of hardship that might have been avoided entirely had circumstances been different. "Why did you leave her?" Oliver asked, his voice sharper than he intended, though he did not take the words back. The Duke did not flinch from the question, though something in his posture seemed to bend slightly under its weight. "My family required me to marry, for the sake of alliance and inheritance. A marriage that had been arranged since before I was even old enough to understand what such arrangements meant. I fought against it as much as I was able, but in the end, duty won over my own wishes, and I lost the only woman I ever truly loved as a result. I did not know she carried a child. Had I known, I promise you, everything would have been different." Eleanor squeezed Oliver's hand gently. "I did not tell him," she admitted, her voice heavy with old regret. "I was too proud, and too afraid of what it might mean for both of us if the truth became known. I thought it better to raise you quietly, away from a world that would never fully accept you, than to force a truth upon a man who had already been forced into enough unwanted arrangements." Oliver sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything he had just learned. 9 years of cold nights, hungry days, and unanswered questions suddenly made a strange, painful sense, though the sense they made did not erase the years themselves. "What happens now?" Oliver asked finally, looking between his mother and the man he now understood to be his father. The Duke stepped closer, kneeling before Oliver, the way he had knelt on the wet street outside the tavern, though this time there was nothing transactional in the gesture, nothing of boots or coins. "Now," he said, "I intend to do everything within my power to make right what circumstance and my own cowardice once made wrong. I want you to come and live at Ashford Hall, both of you, where you will want for nothing ever again. I want to give you the life you should have had from the beginning, and I want to acknowledge you, publicly, as my son." The words landed on Oliver like a wave he had not braced himself for, and he found himself unable to speak, his mind racing through the implications of what such a life would mean, a life of warmth, of food, of education, of belonging to a family he had never known he possessed. "And my mother?" Oliver asked, glancing at Eleanor, who watched the exchange with an expression caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. "Your mother will be honored and cared for as she deserves," the Duke said firmly, regardless of what the world outside these walls chooses to say about it. I have wasted 9 years already, through my own ignorance of the truth. I do not intend to waste a single day more." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, though for the first time since Oliver had known her, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sorrow. She reached out and took the Duke's hand, an old familiarity passing between them, that spoke of a bond neither time nor distance had ever fully broken. Oliver watched the two adults before him, his parents, a word he had never before been able to use in its complete form, and felt something shift inside his chest, a lifetime of quiet loneliness beginning, slowly, to give way to something he had never dared hope for. But even as hope bloomed within him, a small, cautious part of his mind, the part that had learned through years of hardship never to trust good fortune too quickly, wondered what such a sudden change might cost them, and what challenges awaited a poor boy, who had once polished boots for a penny, now stepping into a world of dukes and inheritance, and old family expectations that had never once considered his existence. He did not yet know how right that caution would prove to be, nor how quickly the peace of that small room would be tested by forces far greater than any he had faced on the cold, wet streets of the city. The carriage ride to Ashford Hall was unlike anything Oliver had ever experienced. He sat pressed against the window, watching the crowded, narrow streets of the city give way to wider roads lined with tall trees, until finally, the estate itself came into view, a building so vast and grand that Oliver momentarily forgot to breathe. Towers of pale stone rose against the gray sky, surrounded by gardens that stretched further than he could see, and a long gravel path led toward an entrance guarded by tall wooden doors that looked as though they belonged to a castle from one of the stories his mother used to tell him. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand resting gently over his, though her own eyes carried a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension as the carriage rolled closer to a place she clearly remembered well from years before. Oliver could only imagine what memories stirred within her, memories of a life she had once been part of before circumstance tore it away. When the carriage finally stopped, a line of household staff had already gathered near the entrance, and Oliver felt a rush of nervousness at the sight of so many unfamiliar faces watching him step down onto the gravel path. Charlotte, who had ridden with them, gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, before leading him and his mother toward the grand doors, where the Duke himself waited to welcome them formally into his home. "Welcome," the Duke said, his voice carrying a warmth Oliver had not fully heard from him before, "to your new home." The words felt strange and unfamiliar in Oliver's ears, a home so different from the single cramped room he had known his entire life that he could hardly reconcile the two ideas as belonging to the same word. He followed the Duke through halls lined with paintings of solemn-faced ancestors, past rooms filled with furniture so fine that Oliver was almost afraid to touch anything, until they arrived at a set of rooms that had been prepared specifically for himself and his mother. His own room contained a bed larger than anything he had ever slept on, blankets thick and soft, a wardrobe already filled with new clothing in his size, and a window that looked out over gardens more beautiful than anything he had imagined possible. He stood in the center of the room for a long moment, simply turning in place, trying to absorb the scale of the change that had come upon him so suddenly. "This is all mine?" he asked Charlotte, who had stayed to help him settle in. "All yours," she confirmed with a smile. "And there is much more to see besides. The Duke has arranged for a tutor to begin your lessons within the week, so that you might catch up quickly on your studies. He wants nothing held back from you now that the truth has come to light." Oliver nodded, though the idea of formal lessons filled him with a nervousness different from anything he had felt polishing boots on cold city streets. He had learned to read a little, taught by his mother during quiet evenings, but the education the sons of dukes typically received was surely far beyond anything he currently possessed. That evening, Oliver sat at a long dining table with his mother and the Duke, a meal spread before them more elaborate than anything he had eaten in his entire life. He watched carefully how the adults used their utensils, trying to mimic their movements so as not to embarrass himself, though the Duke, noticing his discomfort, simply smiled gently and told him there was no need to rush, that manners could be learned in time, just as everything else could be learned in time. It was during this meal that a servant entered quietly and informed the Duke that his cousin, Lord Gerald Ashford, had arrived unexpectedly and wished to speak with him at once. The Duke's expression shifted slightly at the name, a flicker of tension passing across his otherwise composed features, though he excused himself politely and left the dining room to attend to his visitor. Oliver glanced at his mother, sensing her own unease at the mention of this unfamiliar cousin. "Who is Lord Gerald?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "The Duke's cousin, and, until recently, the man expected to inherit Ashford Hall and its title, should the Duke remain without an heir of his own. I imagine he will not be pleased by the news of your existence, Oliver." The words settled uncomfortably in Oliver's stomach, and he found himself losing his appetite despite the richness of the food before him. He had not considered, in the excitement and relief of discovering his father, that his arrival might threaten the ambitions of others within this new and unfamiliar world. From beyond the dining room doors, raised voices could be faintly heard, the Duke's tone measured but firm, and another voice, sharper and more agitated, responding with clear displeasure. Oliver strained to catch the words, though the thick walls of the estate muffled most of the conversation into indistinct sound. After several long minutes, the Duke returned to the dining room alone, his expression carefully composed once more, though Oliver could sense the tension still lingering beneath the surface. "Forgive the interruption," the Duke said, resuming his seat at the table. "Family matters, nothing more." Oliver wanted to ask more, wanted to understand fully what threat, if any, this Lord Gerald represented to the peaceful new life he had only just begun to imagine for himself and his mother. But something in his father's expression told him this was not the moment for such questions. Instead, he finished his meal quietly, his mind circling around the unfamiliar worry that had crept into what had otherwise been the happiest evening of his life. Later that night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar comfort of his new bed, Oliver rose quietly and wandered the halls of Ashford Hall, drawn by curiosity toward the grand portraits that lined the walls, faces of ancestors long past, each one staring down with the same solemn, aristocratic expression. He paused before one portrait in particular, a younger version of the Duke himself, standing beside a woman Oliver did not recognize, dressed in the fine clothing of nobility. "That is my late wife," a voice said quietly from behind him, and Oliver turned to find the Duke standing there, dressed still in his evening clothes, apparently as unable to sleep as Oliver himself. "She passed some years ago, before illness could be properly treated. We were never blessed with children of our own, which is part of why Lord Gerald believed himself destined to inherit this estate." Oliver did not know what to say, sensing the weight of grief still present in the Duke's voice, despite the years that had passed. "I am sorry," he offered simply. "Do not be," the Duke said, offering a small, tired smile. "It was a marriage of duty rather than affection, though I came to care for her, in my own way, over the years. Her passing was difficult, but it was your mother I truly loved, Oliver, and it is you, now, who represents the only true happiness circumstance has ever allowed me." The words settled warmly in Oliver's chest, easing some of the unease that Lord Gerald's unexpected visit had stirred within him. "Will he try to stop this?" Oliver asked quietly. "Lord Gerald, I mean. Will he try to stop me from being your son?" The Duke's expression grew serious, though his voice remained steady and reassuring. "He will certainly try to challenge the arrangement, as is his right by law to question such matters. But I promise you, Oliver, I will not allow anyone, cousin or otherwise, to take from you what is rightfully yours. You are my son, and no amount of family politics will change that truth." Oliver nodded, though a small, persistent worry remained lodged within him, a worry that told him the challenges of this new life, however grand and comfortable it appeared on the surface, were only just beginning, and that Lord Gerald's unexpected visit was merely the first ripple of a much larger storm gathering on the horizon of his newfound family's peace. As he returned to his room that night, the soft blankets and warm fire doing little to fully ease the uncertainty in his heart, Oliver found himself wondering, for the first time since stepping into this grand and unfamiliar world, whether the price of belonging to such a family might prove far steeper than he had ever imagined, and whether the quiet, hungry days of polishing boots on cold city streets had, in their own difficult way, been simpler than the battles that now lay ahead of him. The following morning brought with it a new routine unlike anything Oliver had known before. A tutor named Mr. Fairweather arrived promptly after breakfast, a patient man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, carrying with him books and papers that filled Oliver with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Lessons began with simple reading and arithmetic, subjects Oliver grasped quickly despite his limited education, his quick mind adapting far faster than even Mr. Fairweather had expected. "Remarkable," the tutor murmured more than once during that first week, watching Oliver work through problems with an eagerness rarely seen in children born into wealth, who had never known the hunger that sharpens a mind toward survival. Oliver found a strange comfort in these lessons, a sense of purpose that reminded him of the determination he had once poured into polishing boots, only now directed toward books and numbers instead. It was during the second week of lessons that Lord Gerald Ashford made his presence known more directly, arriving unannounced one afternoon, while Oliver sat in the study practicing his penmanship. The door opened without a knock, and a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes stepped inside, studying Oliver with open disdain before speaking a single word. "So, this is the boy," Lord Gerald said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The street urchin my cousin has decided to call his heir." Oliver set down his pen carefully, unsure how to respond to such open hostility from a stranger, though he refused to lower his eyes, despite the intimidation clearly intended by the man's tone and posture. "I am Oliver Hartley," he said simply, "the Duke's son." Lord Gerald laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. The Duke's mistake, more likely. A boy raised in the gutters, polishing boots for pennies, suddenly expected to inherit an estate and title that has been in this family for generations. "Do you truly believe yourself capable of such a role, boy?" Oliver's chest tightened with a mixture of anger and hurt, though he forced himself to remain calm, remembering the countless times he had swallowed his pride while working the cold streets, learning long ago that reacting with anger rarely improved a difficult situation. "I did not ask for any of this," Oliver said quietly, "but I will not apologize for who I am, or for where I came from." Something flickered across Lord Gerald's face at this response, perhaps surprise at the boy's composure, though it was quickly replaced by the same cold disdain as before. "We shall see how long that confidence lasts," he said. "Once the courts and the peerage take a closer look at your mother's claims. These matters are rarely as simple as my cousin seems to believe." With that, Lord Gerald turned and left the study as abruptly as he had entered, leaving Oliver alone with Mr. Fairweather, who had watched the exchange in uncomfortable silence. "Pay him no mind," the tutor said gently, once the door had closed. "His words carry more bitterness than truth. Focus instead on your lessons, and let the adults settle matters of law and inheritance." But Oliver found it difficult to fully return his attention to his studies after such an encounter, the sharp edge of Lord Gerald's words lingering in his mind, long after the man himself had departed. He thought of his mother, resting still in her own chambers, as she continued to regain her strength, and he wondered how many more such encounters awaited them both in this unfamiliar world of titles and inheritance. That evening, over dinner, Oliver mentioned the encounter to the Duke, watching his father's expression grow tight with barely contained frustration. "Gerald has always resented the idea of anyone standing between himself and this estate," the Duke explained, setting down his utensils. "He pursued a legal case years ago, questioning my own right to the title, before eventually abandoning it, once the evidence proved overwhelmingly against him. I suspect he intends something similar now." "Can he truly stop this?" Oliver asked, glancing toward his mother, who listened with quiet concern. "Can he take everything away, even though it's true? Even though you've acknowledged me?" The Duke was quiet for a moment, before answering carefully. "The law requires proof, Oliver. Proper documentation and witnesses to confirm the legitimacy of a claim such as yours. I intend to secure everything necessary to protect your position, but I will not pretend the process will be simple or without challenge. Gerald has connections within the courts, and he will use every resource available to delay or dispute your rightful place in this family." Eleanor reached across the table, taking Oliver's hand gently. "Whatever happens, my love, know that you are loved, and that nothing Lord Gerald says or does can change the truth of who you are." Oliver nodded, though the weight of the coming challenge settled heavily upon him nonetheless. He had spent his entire life fighting for survival on the cold, unforgiving streets of the city, and he had believed, perhaps foolishly, that arriving at Ashford Hall would mark the end of such struggles. Instead, it seemed a new kind of battle was only just beginning, one fought not with boot polish and pennies, but with documents, courts, and the cold ambitions of a man determined to protect his own inheritance at any cost. Over the following weeks, the Duke worked tirelessly to gather the evidence necessary to secure Oliver's legitimacy, seeking out witnesses who could confirm the relationship between himself and Eleanor from years before, securing documentation of Oliver's birth, and consulting with lawyers well-versed in matters of inheritance and peerage law. Oliver, meanwhile, continued his lessons with Mr. Fairweather, determined to prove himself worthy of the position he had been given, regardless of what Lord Gerald or anyone else might say about his humble origins. Charlotte became something of a friend to Oliver during this time, patiently teaching him the proper manners and customs expected of someone in his new position, from how to properly greet visiting nobility, to which utensils belonged with which course of a formal meal. She never once made him feel foolish for his lack of knowledge, instead treating each lesson as simply another skill to be learned, much like reading or arithmetic. "You learn quickly," Charlotte told him one afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's expansive gardens, "faster than most children born into this life ever bother to learn such things, having never known what it means to want for something and work hard to earn it." Oliver smiled at the compliment, though a persistent worry remained lodged in his chest regarding Lord Gerald's threats. "Do you think he will succeed?" Oliver asked quietly, "in taking this all away from me?" Charlotte considered the question seriously before answering. "I think your father loves you very much, and will fight harder for your place in this family than Lord Gerald could ever fight against it. But I also think, Oliver, that whatever happens, you have already proven yourself capable of surviving far greater hardships than a legal dispute over inheritance. You survived hunger, and cold, and loss, for years, without ever losing your kindness, or your determination." Her words offered Oliver a measure of comfort, though the shadow of Lord Gerald's ambitions continued to loom over the otherwise peaceful days at Ashford Hall, a reminder that the world he had entered, however grand and comfortable, contained its own dangers, ones that required a different kind of strength than the physical endurance he had relied upon during his years on the city streets. As autumn deepened and the gardens outside began to shed their leaves, word arrived that Lord Gerald had formally filed a legal challenge against Oliver's legitimacy, setting in motion a court proceeding that would determine, once and for all, whether the poor boy who once polished boots for a penny would be allowed to remain the acknowledged son and heir of the Duke of Ashford, or whether he would be cast back into the poverty from which he had so briefly escaped. The news of the legal challenge spread through Ashford Hall like a cold wind through an open door, and Oliver noticed the change immediately in the way certain members of the household staff looked at him, some with pity, others with a cautious distance, as though unwilling to grow too attached to a boy whose place in the family remained uncertain. Only Charlotte and Mr. Fairweather continued to treat him exactly as they always had, refusing to let the shadow of Lord Gerald's ambitions alter their kindness. The Duke called Oliver and Eleanor into his study one evening to explain the details of what lay ahead. "The court has set a date for the hearing," he said gravely. "1 month from now. Lord Gerald intends to argue that the circumstances of Oliver's birth, occurring outside the bounds of marriage, disqualify him from any legitimate claim to inheritance, regardless of my own acknowledgement of him as my son." "Can he win?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with worry. "It is possible," the Duke admitted honestly, refusing to offer false comfort where none was warranted. "The law in matters such as these can be complicated, and Gerald has retained skilled counsel to argue his position. But I have my own evidence, and I intend to fight this with everything at my disposal." Oliver listened to this exchange with a growing sense of unease, the comfortable life he had only just begun to settle into, now threatened by forces entirely beyond his control. He thought of the cold streets he had left behind, the hunger, the endless work for pennies that barely kept himself and his mother alive, and he found himself gripped by a fear more intense than any he had felt even during his mother's illness. "What happens if he wins?" Oliver asked quietly, though he already suspected the answer. The Duke's expression grew heavy. "If the court rules in his favor, I would lose the legal right to name you my heir, though I would still do everything in my power to provide for you and your mother privately, regardless of what title or inheritance you might be denied." It was not the reassurance Oliver had hoped for, though he appreciated his father's honesty, even in the face of such difficult possibilities. That night, unable to sleep, Oliver found himself once again wandering the halls of Ashford Hall, his mind turning over the unfairness of a system that would deny him his rightful place simply because of circumstances he had no control over as an infant. It was during one such sleepless wandering that he encountered Charlotte, who had noticed the light beneath his door and come to check on him, sensing his distress even through the closed wood. "You should be resting," she said gently, finding him seated on the floor of the long gallery, staring up at the portraits of ancestors who had never known hunger or fear the way Oliver had known them. "How can I rest?" Oliver replied, "when everything might be taken away in a single court hearing? All of this, my father, this home, even my own name, might mean nothing in a month's time." Charlotte sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Let me tell you something, Oliver, about the difference between titles and truth. A court can decide many things, matters of law and inheritance and property. But no court in this land has the power to decide who your father truly is, or to erase the love that exists between you and your parents. Whatever happens in that hearing, the truth of your birth will remain exactly as it is. But the money, the estate, the name," Oliver said, "those things matter too, don't they? Without them, what happens to my mother? What happens to the life I've only just begun to imagine for myself?" Charlotte considered this carefully before responding. "They matter, certainly, and I do not wish to pretend otherwise. But you survived years of hardship before ever knowing your father existed, Oliver. You found a way to care for your mother, even in the depths of poverty, through nothing but your own determination and courage. That strength does not disappear simply because a court rules against you. Whatever the outcome, you will find a way forward, just as you always have." Her words offered Oliver a measure of comfort, though the anxiety surrounding the coming hearing continued to weigh on him heavily over the following weeks. He threw himself into his lessons with even greater determination, as though proving his intelligence and capability to Mr. Fairweather might somehow influence the outcome of a legal matter entirely separate from his studies, though he understood, even as he did so, that such efforts likely made no real difference to the court's eventual decision. The Duke, meanwhile, worked tirelessly alongside his lawyers, gathering testimony from old acquaintances who could confirm the nature of his relationship with Eleanor from years before, securing documentation that traced Oliver's birth back to the precise timeline of their affair, and consulting extensively on the finer points of inheritance law as it applied to circumstances such as theirs. Eleanor, too, found herself called upon to provide testimony, a prospect that clearly filled her with dread, given the private nature of the memories she would be forced to share publicly. Oliver watched his mother grow increasingly withdrawn as the hearing date approached, her earlier improvement in health and spirit giving way once more to a quiet anxiety that reminded him uncomfortably of the fear she had carried during her illness. "I should never have agreed to this," Eleanor confided in Oliver one evening, as they sat together in her chambers, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "Perhaps it would have been simpler to remain quiet, to let you grow up without ever knowing the truth of your father, sparing us both this public scrutiny and uncertainty." "No," Oliver said firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "I am glad I know the truth, Mother. Regardless of what the court decides, I would rather know who I truly am, and fight for my place in this family, than live in comfortable ignorance forever. Whatever happens, I do not regret learning the truth." Eleanor studied her son for a long moment, something like pride flickering across her tired features. "You have grown so much, Oliver, in such a short time. The boy who once knelt in the mud, polishing boots for pennies, has become someone capable of facing even the greatest uncertainties with courage. I learned that courage from you," Oliver replied simply, "watching you fight through illness and poverty without ever giving up on either of us." As the weeks passed and the hearing date drew ever closer, Ashford Hall settled into an uneasy quiet, each member of the household aware that the coming proceedings would determine far more than simply Oliver's legal status. The very future of the estate itself, its inheritance and its legacy, hung suspended in the balance, waiting for a judgment that would either confirm or destroy the fragile new family that had only just begun to take shape from the ashes of old secrets and long-buried love. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, mirroring the same weather that had accompanied Oliver's very first encounter with the Duke outside the tavern so many months before. He dressed carefully in the fine clothing provided for him, his hands trembling slightly as Charlotte helped adjust his collar, her own expression carrying a tension she tried, unsuccessfully, to hide from him. "Remember," she said softly, "whatever is said in that courtroom today, It changes nothing about who you are." Oliver nodded, though the words offered little comfort against the anxiety twisting in his stomach. The carriage ride to the courthouse felt longer than any journey he had taken before, his mother sitting beside him in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while the Duke rode opposite them, his expression composed but his eyes betraying the same tension that gripped them all. The courthouse itself was an imposing building of gray stone, and Oliver felt the weight of countless curious stares as they entered, whispers following them down the long corridor toward the chamber where the hearing would take place. Word of the case had clearly spread through certain circles of society, and those gathered outside the courtroom seemed eager to witness the outcome of such an unusual dispute. Inside the chamber, Lord Gerald sat already at his designated table, flanked by two lawyers whose expressions carried the same cold confidence as their employer. He glanced briefly toward Oliver as they entered, offering nothing more than a thin, humorless smile before returning his attention to the papers before him. The judge, an elderly man with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, called the proceedings to order shortly after, and the arguments began. Lord Gerald's lawyer spoke first, outlining the case against Oliver's legitimacy with cold precision, questioning the validity of testimony given by servants and old acquaintances, suggesting that the timeline of Eleanor's relationship with the Duke could not be proven with sufficient certainty to establish Oliver as his rightful son. Oliver listened to these arguments with a growing sense of helplessness, watching as his own existence was reduced to legal technicalities and disputed timelines, as though the truth of his birth were simply a matter to be argued over rather than a fact of his life. He glanced at his mother, whose face had grown pale, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, as the lawyer continued his methodical dismantling of their case. When it came time for the Duke's counsel to respond, the arguments shifted toward the evidence they had gathered. Testimony from Dr. Whitfield confirming the timeline of Oliver's birth, letters exchanged between Eleanor and the Duke from years before that had survived in a private collection, and the Duke's own sworn testimony regarding the nature of his relationship with Eleanor prior to his arranged marriage. Eleanor was called to testify next, and Oliver watched with a mixture of pride and worry as his mother rose to take her place before the court, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier as she spoke of the years she had spent raising Oliver alone, of the love she had shared with the Duke before circumstances tore them apart, and of her own reasons for remaining silent about Oliver's true parentage for so many years. Lord Gerald's lawyer cross-examined her harshly, questioning her motives, suggesting that her sudden reappearance in the Duke's life, coinciding so conveniently with his need for an heir, raised troubling questions about the authenticity of her claims. Oliver felt anger rise in his chest at the implication, watching his mother's composure waver under the relentless questioning, though she held firm, refusing to let the lawyer's accusations shake the truth of her testimony. It was during a brief recess in the proceedings that something unexpected occurred. An elderly woman, unfamiliar to Oliver, approached the Duke's legal team with a quiet urgency, speaking in hushed tones that Oliver could not fully hear from where he sat. Moments later, the Duke's lawyer approached the judge with a request to introduce new evidence, a request that visibly unsettled Lord Gerald's own legal counsel. The elderly woman, it turned out, had once served as a midwife in the very neighborhood where Eleanor had lived during the final months of her pregnancy, and she carried with her original records documenting the exact date of Oliver's birth, records that aligned precisely with the timeline the Duke's case depended upon. Her testimony, delivered with the simple honesty of someone with no stake in the outcome beyond the truth itself, carried a weight that the court could not easily dismiss. Lord Gerald's expression darkened visibly as the midwife's testimony unfolded, his earlier confidence giving way to something closer to desperation as his legal team scrambled to find some flaw in her account. But her records were clear, her memory of the events precise, despite the years that had passed, and Oliver felt a flicker of hope rekindle within his chest as he watched the tide of the hearing begin, ever so slightly, to turn in their favor. The judge called for a final recess before delivering his judgment, and the long hours that followed felt to Oliver like the longest of his entire life, longer even than the days he had spent nursing his mother through her fever, longer than the countless hours he had knelt in the cold polishing boots for pennies that barely kept them fed. He sat beside his mother in a small waiting chamber, neither of them speaking, both too anxious to find any words adequate to the moment. The Duke joined them briefly during this waiting period, his own composure finally cracking slightly under the strain of uncertainty. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, kneeling before Oliver, much as he had done on that first rainy day outside the tavern, "know that you are my son, and nothing this court decides will ever change that truth in my own heart." Oliver nodded, unable to find words sufficient to the weight of the moment, and simply reached out to take his father's hand, a gesture that spoke more clearly than any words could have of the bond that had formed between them, despite the brevity of their time together. When the call finally came that the judge was ready to deliver his verdict, Oliver felt his heart pounding so loudly, he feared everyone in the chamber might hear it, as they filed back into the courtroom to await the decision that would determine not only his own future, but the future of the family he had only just begun to know. The courtroom fell into complete silence as the judge settled into his seat, papers spread before him, his expression giving away nothing of the decision he was about to deliver. Oliver sat between his mother and the Duke, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white, his eyes fixed on the elderly judge, as though staring hard enough might somehow influence the words about to be spoken. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony presented before this court, the judge began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, including the newly introduced records of the midwife, Mrs. Talbot. This court finds sufficient evidence to establish the legitimacy of the claim brought forward by the Duke of Ashford regarding his son, Oliver Hartley. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their full meaning registered fully in Oliver's mind, and when it finally did, he felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that tears sprang immediately to his eyes, tears he made no effort to hide despite the public nature of the setting. Beside him, his mother let out a small, broken sound of relief, her hand gripping his tightly as the judge continued to outline the formal ruling that would recognize Oliver as the legitimate son and heir of the Duke. Lord Gerald's face, visible across the courtroom, had gone rigid with barely contained fury. His earlier confidence collapsed entirely into something bitter and cold. He rose from his seat as the judge finished speaking, his voice sharp with anger as he addressed the court. "This ruling will be appealed," he declared, though the judge simply regarded him with the patient weariness of a man who had heard such threats many times before. "That is, of course, your right," the judge replied evenly, "though I would advise your counsel to consider carefully the strength of the evidence already presented before pursuing such a course further." Lord Gerald stormed from the courtroom without another word, his lawyers hurrying to gather their papers before following him out, leaving behind a chamber filled with quiet murmurs of surprise and, from many corners, genuine warmth toward the young boy who had just secured his rightful place within one of the most prominent families in the region. Outside the courthouse, as they made their way back toward the waiting carriage, Oliver felt as though he were walking through a dream, the reality of the judge's ruling still settling slowly into his understanding. The Duke placed a firm hand on his shoulder as they walked, his own relief evident in the lightness of his usually composed features. "You did it," the Duke said, "or rather, we did it, together, as a family should." Eleanor, walking on Oliver's other side, seemed lighter than Oliver had seen her in months, the anxiety that had gripped her throughout the proceedings, finally beginning to loosen its hold. "It is finally over," she said softly, though something in her tone suggested she understood, even in this moment of victory, that new challenges would inevitably arise in their unfamiliar new life. The carriage ride back to Ashford Hall felt entirely different from the tense journey that had carried them to the courthouse earlier that morning. Oliver watched the passing countryside with a lightness in his chest he had rarely experienced, the constant undercurrent of fear that had shadowed him since Lord Gerald's initial challenge, finally beginning to dissolve into something closer to genuine hope for the future. Upon their return to the estate, the household staff had gathered to greet them, word of the favorable ruling having already reached the hall ahead of their arrival through swift messengers. Charlotte rushed forward to embrace Oliver, tears of joy visible in her own eyes as she congratulated him on the outcome of the hearing. "I told you," she said, laughing through her tears, "that no court could ever change the truth of who you are. It seems the court agreed with me." That evening, a small celebration was held within the great hall of the estate, a gathering far more modest than the grand affairs Oliver would later learn were typical of noble households, but filled with genuine warmth and relief from everyone present. Mr. Fairweather offered his own congratulations, along with a gentle reminder that Oliver's lessons would resume the following morning with renewed vigor, an idea that, for once, Oliver welcomed with genuine enthusiasm, rather than the usual mild dread. As the celebration wound down, and guests began to retire for the evening, the Duke found a quiet moment to speak with Oliver, alone in his study, the same room where they had first discussed the legal challenge weeks before. "I want you to understand something," the Duke said, settling into the chair opposite Oliver's own. "The ruling today secures your legal rights, but it does not erase the challenges that still lie ahead. There will be those within society who continue to view you with suspicion or resentment, simply because of the unusual circumstances of your birth and upbringing." Oliver nodded, understanding the truth of this warning even amid the joy of their victory. "I have faced difficult people before," he said, "on the streets, in the tavern, wherever pennies needed to be earned. I believe I can face difficult people here as well, so long as I know my family stands beside me." The Duke smiled, a rare expression of genuine warmth that Oliver had come to recognize as reserved for only the most sincere moments between them. "You will always have that, Oliver. Whatever challenges lie ahead, know that your place within this family, and within my heart, was never truly in question, regardless of what any court might have decided today." As Oliver finally retired to his own chambers that night, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day's proceedings, he found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from a cold, wet street outside a tavern to the legally recognized heir of one of the region's most prominent estates. The boy who had once knelt in the mud, polishing boots for a single penny, now possessed a name, a family, and a future that stretched before him with possibilities he could scarcely have imagined only months before. Yet even as he drifted toward sleep, a small, cautious voice within him wondered whether Lord Gerald's bitter declaration of an appeal represented merely the final gasp of a defeated adversary, or the opening move of a longer struggle, still waiting to unfold in the months and years ahead. A struggle that would test not only Oliver's legal claim to his new life, but his own character and resilience, as he learned to navigate the complicated, often treacherous world of nobility and inheritance that he now called home. The weeks following the court ruling brought a period of adjustment unlike anything Oliver had yet experienced at Ashford Hall. Word of the case had spread widely through society, and invitations began arriving at the estate for gatherings and events where Oliver would be expected to appear alongside his father, formally introduced as the recognized heir to the Ashford title and fortune. The prospect filled him with a nervousness entirely different from the fear of the courtroom, a social anxiety rooted in his awareness of how differently he had been raised compared to the other children of nobility he would soon be expected to mingle among. Charlotte and Mr. Fairweather worked tirelessly to prepare him for these occasions, teaching him not only the proper manners expected in such settings, but also helping him understand the subtle social dynamics of a world built on centuries of tradition and expectation. Oliver absorbed these lessons with the same determination he had once applied to earning pennies on the street, understanding that survival in this new world required a different, but equally demanding set of skills. The first such gathering, a modest dinner hosted by a family friendly to the Duke, proved more difficult than Oliver had anticipated. Whispers followed him through the rooms, curious glances from other children his age, who had clearly heard the scandalous story of his origins, and polite but distant greetings from adults who seemed unsure how to properly address a boy whose position within society remained, despite the court's ruling, somewhat unprecedented. One young boy, the son of a visiting baron, approached Oliver directly during the evening, his expression carrying the open curiosity and casual cruelty that children sometimes possess without fully understanding its weight. "Is it true," the boy asked, "that you used to polish boots on the street for pennies, before anyone knew who your father was?" Oliver felt the old instinct to shrink from such a question, the shame that had never fully left him despite his changed circumstances, but he remembered Charlotte's words from months before, that his years of hardship represented strength rather than weakness, and he answered the question directly, without flinching. "Yes, it's true. I worked hard every day to help care for my mother, and I am not ashamed of that work, regardless of what anyone else might think of it." The boy seemed momentarily surprised by such a direct and unapologetic response, having perhaps expected embarrassment or defensive anger, rather than simple, confident honesty. "I suppose that's rather admirable," he admitted eventually. "Working so hard at such a young age, most of us have never had to work for anything at all." The exchange, while brief, gave Oliver a small measure of confidence that would serve him well throughout the following months, as he continued to navigate the complicated social world of the nobility, with a directness that some found refreshing and others found unsettling, depending on their own comfort with tradition and expectation. Meanwhile, word arrived that Lord Gerald had indeed filed his promised appeal, though the process moved slowly through the courts, granting Oliver and his family a period of relative peace, even as the legal threat continued to loom somewhere in the background of their daily lives. The Duke assured Oliver repeatedly that the strength of their original evidence made a successful appeal unlikely, though he never dismissed the possibility entirely, preferring honesty over false comfort, even when the truth carried some measure of continued uncertainty. It was during this period of waiting that Oliver's relationship with his father deepened considerably, the two of them spending increasing amounts of time together, as the Duke took a personal interest in Oliver's education beyond simply academic lessons, teaching him about the management of the estate, the responsibilities that would eventually fall upon his shoulders, and the history of the family name he now carried. A title is not simply about privilege, the Duke explained one afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's expansive grounds, inspecting the tenant farms that formed the economic foundation of the Ashford wealth. It carries responsibility toward those who depend upon our stewardship, the farmers who work this land, the servants who maintain this household, the tenants in the surrounding villages, who look to us for fair and just treatment. Oliver listened carefully, understanding intuitively the weight of such responsibility, given his own years of experience among those who struggled daily, simply to survive. "I want to be fair," he said, "to remember what it felt like to go hungry, to have nothing, when I someday hold the responsibilities you carry now." The Duke smiled, placing a proud hand on Oliver's shoulder. "That, Oliver, is precisely the quality that will make you a better Duke than most who inherit this title, without ever having known genuine hardship. Your experience, difficult as it was, has given you a perspective that many in our position sorely lack." Eleanor, too, found herself settling gradually into her new position within the household, though the transition from poverty to nobility proved challenging in its own ways. She had spent years accustomed to managing every detail of survival herself, and the presence of servants eager to attend to her every need felt, at times, uncomfortably foreign to a woman who had grown accustomed to relying solely on her own strength and resourcefulness. It was Charlotte who helped bridge this gap, becoming not merely a servant attending to Eleanor's needs, but a genuine friend who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the household, the difficulty of adjusting to such a dramatically altered life. The two women grew close over the following weeks, sharing quiet conversations over tea that helped ease Eleanor's transition into her new role as the acknowledged partner of the Duke of Ashford. As autumn deepened further into the cold months of early winter, word finally arrived that the appellate court had reviewed Lord Gerald's challenge and found no grounds sufficient to overturn the original ruling, affirming once and for all Oliver's legitimate place as the Duke's son and heir. The news brought a wave of relief throughout Ashford Hall, though Oliver noted, with a mixture of sympathy and wariness, that Lord Gerald's bitterness toward him seemed unlikely to fade, regardless of the court's final decision. Indeed, though Lord Gerald ceased his legal challenges following the appellate ruling, he made his continued disapproval known through more subtle means, spreading quiet rumors through certain social circles, questioning Oliver's suitability for the position he now held. Rumors that Oliver learned to endure with the same quiet resilience he had developed during his years on the city streets, understanding that not every battle required a direct confrontation to be won. By the time winter's first snow began to fall over the grounds of Ashford Hall, Oliver had settled sufficiently into his new life that he found himself, for the first time since his arrival, able to simply enjoy the beauty of his surroundings, without the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had shadowed his earlier months at the estate. He stood at the window of his chambers one snowy evening, watching the white flakes drift silently down over the gardens below, and found himself thinking, with a strange mixture of gratitude and melancholy, of the cold streets where he had once knelt polishing boots for pennies, streets that had shaped him into the boy now standing warm and secure within the walls of a grand estate he could once only have imagined in his most fantastic daydreams. A full year had passed since the rainy afternoon when Oliver first knelt in the mud outside the Grey Anchor Tavern, offering to polish a stranger's boots in exchange for a single penny that might help keep his fever-stricken mother alive one more day. Standing now in the same great hall where he had once felt so lost and uncertain among unfamiliar portraits and grand furnishings, Oliver hardly recognized the boy he had once been, though he never allowed himself to forget the lessons that boy had learned through years of hardship and quiet determination. The occasion marking this anniversary was a formal gathering hosted at Ashford Hall, a celebration of Oliver's 10th birthday, combined with the Duke's formal announcement, before the assembled nobility of the region, of Oliver's official designation as heir to the estate and title. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with garlands and candles that cast a warm glow over the gathered guests, many of whom had, over the preceding year, come to genuinely respect the boy whose unusual origins had once caused such scandal and controversy. Lord Gerald had not been invited to the celebration, his continued bitterness toward Oliver having eventually led to a complete estrangement from the rest of the family, though word occasionally reached Ashford Hall of his diminished circumstances following the failure of his legal challenges, circumstances that Oliver, despite everything, found himself regarding with more sympathy than satisfaction, having learned too well himself the difficulties that came with loss and diminished fortune. Standing before the assembled guests that evening, dressed in fine clothing that had become as familiar to him now as the ragged garments of his earlier years once had been, Oliver listened as his father rose to address the gathering, his voice carrying clearly through the warm, candle-lit hall. "A year ago," the Duke began, his eyes finding Oliver across the room, "I met a boy kneeling in the rain, offering to polish my boots for nothing more than the chance to beg for help for his ailing mother. I did not know, in that moment, that I was meeting my own son, a truth that circumstance and my own past mistakes had kept hidden from me for nearly a decade." Murmurs passed through the gathered crowd, though none carried the scandalized tone such words might once have provoked. The story of Oliver's discovery having become, over the preceding year, something closer to a celebrated tale of fortune and redemption, rather than a source of shame. "In the time since that day," the Duke continued, "I have come to understand that the true measure of a man, or indeed a boy, soon to become a man, lies not in the circumstances of his birth, nor in the wealth or poverty of his upbringing, but in the strength of his character, the resilience of his spirit, and the kindness he shows toward others, despite whatever hardships he himself has faced. My son Oliver has demonstrated all of these qualities in abundance, and it is with tremendous pride that I formally present him tonight as the rightful heir to the Ashford name and legacy." The assembled guests applauded warmly, and Oliver felt his mother's hand find his own, squeezing gently as tears of pride glistened in her eyes. He thought, in that moment, of all the difficult days that had led to this one, the countless hours spent kneeling in cold puddles polishing the boots of strangers who barely acknowledged his existence, the desperate fear of losing his mother to illness, the anxious weeks awaiting the court's judgment on his very legitimacy as a human being, deserving of his father's name. After the formal announcement concluded, Oliver found himself approached by many of the same guests who had once regarded him with suspicion or curiosity, now offering genuine congratulations and warm wishes for his future. He accepted these greetings with the same quiet grace Charlotte had spent months teaching him, though he never forgot, even amid such genuine warmth, the years of struggle that had shaped him into someone capable of receiving such honors, with humility rather than arrogance. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had concluded and most of the guests had departed, Oliver found a quiet moment alone with his father, in the same study where they had first discussed the challenges awaiting them, following Lord Gerald's initial legal threat. The room felt different now, warmer somehow, filled with the comfortable familiarity of a year spent building a genuine relationship between father and son. "Do you ever think about that day?" Oliver asked. "The day you stopped your carriage outside the tavern? What made you pause for a boy polishing boots in the rain, when countless others surely passed you by every single day without ever catching your attention?" The Duke considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I have asked myself that very question many times over this past year, Oliver. Perhaps it was simply chance, or perhaps something deeper recognized you before my conscious mind fully understood what it was seeing. Whatever the reason, I have never once regretted stopping that carriage, nor spending that single moment listening to a desperate boy's plea for help." Oliver smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the crackling fire nearby. "I am grateful you did," he said simply, "for everything that came after." "As am I," the Duke replied, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, more grateful than words could ever properly express. Standing together in that quiet study, father and son reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey that began with nothing more than a single penny offered for a stranger's boots, and had transformed, through courage, honesty, and unexpected kindness, into a bond neither time nor circumstance would ever again be able to break. Outside, the winter snow continued to fall softly over the grounds of Ashford Hall, blanketing the estate in quiet white beauty, while inside, warmth and belonging had finally found their way into the heart of a boy who had once believed such things existed only in the stories his mother used to tell him on the coldest, hungriest nights of his difficult but ultimately triumphant childhood.